We have more reaction to the final autopsy report that was issued by the Franklin County Coroner's Office for Casey Goodson Jr. The report says that Goodson was shot 5 times in the back, once in the buttock.
The tragic shooting of Casey Goodson Jr. on December 4th, 2020, in Columbus, Ohio, sent shockwaves through the community and the nation. The death of this 23-year-old black man at the hands of a sheriff's deputy sparked outrage, protests, and an ongoing fight for justice. The case is complex and controversial, with conflicting accounts and far-reaching implications for policing and racial equity in America. In today's video, we'll explore the details surrounding Casey's death, the background of the key individuals involved, and the winding path of the investigations and legal proceedings that followed. Our aim is to provide a thoughtful, objective analysis of this case, while never forgetting the human tragedy at its core, a young life cut short under disputed circumstances. As we delve into this sensitive topic, we must approach it with empathy and respect for the immense loss and pain experienced by Casey's family and loved ones. At the same time, we cannot ignore the broader societal issues this case brings to the forefront. Police use of force and racial profiling are critical matters that demand our attention and action. By examining the specifics of how and why Casey died, we hope to shed light on these issues and gain constructive insights that could help prevent future tragedies like this from occurring. So let's come together as a community, engage in respectful dialogue, and work towards a more just and equitable society for all. If you appreciate this type of thoughtful, in-depth content, please consider hitting that like button and subscribing to the channel. Your support helps us continue to create videos that tackle important issues and raise awareness about cases like Casey Goodson Jr.'s. Now, with an open mind and a heavy heart, let's respectfully and thoroughly examine the Casey Goodson Jr. case. The events of December 4th, 2020. On that fateful Friday afternoon, Casey Goodson Jr., a 23-year-old black man, was going about his day like any other. He had just left a dentist appointment and stopped to pick up sandwiches for his family before returning to his grandmother's house, where he lived. Casey was a law-abiding citizen with no criminal record and had obtained a license to carry a concealed weapon, which he had with him that day.
Jared and Jen Goodson's mother and attorney Sean Walton have been here for every day of this trial, and they were here for the last few days as deliberations were going on. Shortly after the mistrial was declared,
little did Casey know that his path would soon cross with Jason Meade, a 17-year veteran of the Franklin County Sheriff's Office. Meade was working with a U.S. Marshals Fugitive Task Force and had been searching unsuccessfully for a fugitive in the same neighborhood where Casey's grandmother lived. As Casey drove through the area, Meade claims to have seen him waving a gun while driving. According to Meade's account, he verbally confronted Casey about the alleged gun-waving incident, at which point Casey reportedly aimed the gun directly at the deputy. Meade claims that Casey then fled the scene, leading to a pursuit that ended outside Casey's grandmother's house. There, Meade alleges that Casey once again pointed his gun at him, prompting the deputy to make a split-second decision that would tragically end Casey's life. Meade opened fire, shooting Casey 6 times from behind as he entered his grandmother's home through the side door. Casey, still clutching the bag of sandwiches he had bought for his family, fell through the doorway and onto the kitchen floor. His keys were still in the door, and his licensed gun was found on his body. However, the gun had no bullet in the chamber, and the safety was still engaged, raising questions about whether Casey had actually threatened the deputy with the weapon. The shots fired by Meade claimed Casey's life within seconds, all while his horrified grandmother and 2 young children were present in the house. The family, who had been waiting for Casey to return with lunch, suddenly found themselves witnessing a devastating tragedy that would change their lives forever. As news of the shooting spread, many critical details surrounding the incident remained disputed or unverified. Unlike many police interactions in recent years, no body camera or security footage captured the crucial moments leading up to and during the shooting. This lack of video evidence made it difficult to corroborate or refute Meade's account of events, leaving investigators and the public with more questions than answers. Serious concerns arose immediately about whether Meade's use of deadly force was justified, given the circumstances. The fact that Casey was shot multiple times from behind as he entered his own home raised red flags for many in the community who questioned the necessity of such force. In the aftermath of the shooting, the Columbus police reached out to the Ohio Bureau of Criminal Investigation, asking them to take over the case. However, the Bureau declined due to the delay in being called to investigate. As a result, the FBI and the Justice Department's Civil Rights Division stepped in and launched their own investigations into the shooting. These federal inquiries would stretch out for many months.
So what is the policy Columbus police officers operate under when they are called out to a scene, and when are they allowed to use force?
Leaving Casey's family and the community anxiously awaiting answers and justice. The tragic events of December 4th, 2020, set in motion a complex and emotionally charged case that would captivate the nation and spark intense debates about racial injustice, police accountability, and the use of force. As more details emerged and the investigations progressed, it became clear that the shooting of Casey Goodson Jr. would be a defining moment in the ongoing struggle for police reform and racial equity in America. Conflicting claims and key questions. From the start, Casey's devastated family rejected Meade's version of events. They portrayed Casey as a gentle soul who worked hard to provide for his loved ones and had no reason to threaten the deputy. They believe Meade, in an unmarked car, never properly identified himself as law enforcement, and that Casey may not have heard any commands because he wore earbud headphones. The family maintains Casey was simply unlocking the side door, as the family routinely used due to a faulty front door. With no idea he was being pursued by law enforcement, they accused Meade of misconduct, using excessive force, and shooting without justification, given Casey had already walked away and had his back turned. On the flip side, Meade claimed his actions were those of an officer in a tense, uncertain, rapidly evolving situation. He says he had reason to believe Casey was armed and dangerous after seeing him brandish a gun while driving, a serious offense. Meade describes Casey as non-compliant to verbal commands and states he fired only after perceiving a gun being pointed at him for the second time, with only Meade's word to go on for these alleged provocations and no civilian eyewitnesses to the shooting itself. The case essentially pitted the deputy's account against the family's incredulous insistence that Casey would never threaten an officer. Key questions loomed as to what exactly transpired between the two men, and whether Meade had valid cause to feel his life was in imminent danger, the typical standard for law enforcement, to deploying lethal force. Further complicating the case were emerging details about Meade's background. He had a history of questionable shootings and complaints alleging excessive force. Even more concerning to some were social media posts and public statements Meade had made endorsing a warrior cop mentality and describing his Christian faith as justification for violent action against evil as a righteous release. This all formed the backdrop as the official investigations ground on for over a year with few updates. An anxious community wondered if the full truth would ever come out, or if Meade would face any consequences for killing an unarmed black man who posed no obvious threat. Asterisk, the indictment and charges. Throughout 2021, pressure continued to mount on the authorities to hold Jason Meade accountable for the death of Casey Goodson Jr. Casey's family tirelessly advocated for criminal charges to be brought against the deputy.
Well, of course, the Justice Department is overseeing the federal part of this investigation, the FBI, into whether the constitutional rights of Casey Goodson were violated.
Refusing to let the case fade from the public eye, they held numerous press conferences and organized protests, insisting that the shooting was unjustified and demanding that Meade face the consequences of his actions. The family's efforts were bolstered by grassroots campaigns that sprung up both locally and online, calling for Meade's arrest and prosecution. Activists and concerned citizens saw the case as yet another example of a white police officer killing an unarmed black man under dubious circumstances, a tragic pattern that had sparked nationwide protests and calls for police reform in recent years. As the months passed with no apparent progress in the investigation, frustration and anger continued to grow. Many in the community questioned why it was taking so long for the authorities to act, given the serious questions surrounding Meade's use of force and the conflicting accounts of what had transpired. Finally, in December 2021, a full year after Casey's death, the Franklin County prosecutor took a significant step forward in the case. The prosecutor convened a grand jury to hear evidence related to the shooting, a process that would determine whether there was sufficient probable cause to bring criminal charges against Meade. After weeks of testimony and deliberation, The grand jury returned a momentous decision, a 5-count indictment against Jason Meade. The charges included 2 counts of murder and 1 count of reckless homicide, some of the most serious offenses that can be levied against a defendant. If convicted, Meade faced the possibility of life in prison. The indictment was a major development in the case and a significant victory for Casey's family and supporters. They hailed the decision as the first step towards achieving justice for Casey and holding Meade accountable for his actions. The family expressed gratitude to the prosecutor's office and the grand jury for their diligence and commitment to pursuing the truth. However, not everyone saw the indictment as a positive or appropriate outcome. Meade's defenders, including the Fraternal Order of Police, a powerful law enforcement union, blasted the charges as a rush to judgment against an officer who had been forced to make a split-second decision in a potentially life-threatening situation. They argued that the grand jury's decision was politically motivated and failed to take into account the realities and challenges faced by police officers on the job. Meade himself maintained his innocence, insisting that his use of force was justified and in line with his training and department policies. He had already retired from the Franklin County Sheriff's Office in July 2021, after 17 years on the force, but now found himself facing the prospect of spending the rest of his life behind bars. Following the indictment, Meade was placed under house arrest after posting a substantial bond. As a condition of his release, he was required to wear an electronic monitoring device and was prohibited from having any contact with Casey's family or possessing firearms.
Coverage of today's decision.
NBC4's Anna Hoffman has been in the courtroom for the entirety of this trial. Anna, we'll start with you on the reaction when the mistrial was announced.
As the criminal case against Meade slowly moved forward, Casey's family also pursued justice on another front. In 2022, they filed a massive wrongful death lawsuit against Meade and the Franklin County Sheriff's Department. The civil complaint alleged that the shooting was not an isolated incident, but rather fit a pattern of misconduct and excessive force by Meade that the department had failed to properly address and discipline. The lawsuit also leveled broader criticisms at the Sheriff's Department, arguing that its use of force policies, training practices, and oversight mechanisms were inadequate and contributed to a culture that tolerated or even encouraged aggressive tactics, particularly against people of color. The family sought significant monetary damages, but more importantly, they hoped the lawsuit would spur systemic changes and reforms within the department to prevent future tragedies like Casey's death. Meanwhile, on the criminal side, legal experts and observers recognized that securing a murder conviction against Meade would be an uphill battle for prosecutors. Police officers are rarely charged, let alone convicted, for on-duty killings, in part due to the wide latitude they are given under the law to use force in response to perceived threats. To overcome this, prosecutors would need to not only rebut Meade's claim of self-defense, but also prove beyond a reasonable doubt that his actions were reckless, unjustified, and unreasonable, given the totality of the circumstances. This is a high legal bar that requires convincing a jury that Meade's fear for his life was unfounded, and that he acted with a disregard for the consequences of his actions. Complicating matters further was the lack of clear, indisputable evidence to support either side's version of events. With no video footage or independent eyewitnesses to the shooting itself, much of the case would hinge on Meade's own testimony and whether his account of feeling threatened by Casey would hold up under scrutiny. Prosecutors, for their part, would likely point to the inconsistencies in Meade's statements, his history of using force, and the fact that Casey was shot multiple times from behind while entering his own home. They would argue that even if Meade genuinely believed Casey posed a threat at some point during their encounter, his response was disproportionate and unreasonable, especially given that Casey was walking away from the deputy at the time he was shot. Ultimately, the question of Meade's guilt or innocence would be left in the hands of a jury. Would they believe that the deputy faced a life-threatening situation that justified his split-second decision to open fire? Or would they conclude that Meade acted with excessive, reckless force in shooting an unarmed man in the back as he entered his own home? The outcome of the trial would hinge on which narrative the jurors found more compelling, a heavy burden given the stakes involved and the intense public scrutiny surrounding the case. As the trial approached, the tension and anticipation in the community reached a fever pitch. For Casey's family and supporters, the criminal proceedings represented a long-awaited opportunity to hold Meade accountable and secure a measure of justice for Casey. But they also recognized that the road ahead would be long and emotionally wrenching, with no guarantee of the outcome they so desperately sought. Regardless of the eventual verdict, one thing was certain. The case of Casey Goodson Jr. and the indictment of Jason Meade had once again brought the urgent issues of police violence, racial profiling, and the need for systemic reform to the forefront of the national conversation. The world would be watching as the trial unfolded, a stark reminder of the high stakes and profound challenges involved in pursuing justice and accountability in cases of police violence against people of color. Asterisk, the trial and its aftermath. In April 2023, the murder trial of Jason Meade commenced, capturing the attention of the nation. The proceedings were emotionally charged and highly anticipated, as the public eagerly awaited the outcome of this controversial case. Over the course of nearly 3 weeks, jurors were presented with dramatically different accounts of the fateful encounter between Meade and Casey Goodson Jr. The prosecution team painted a picture of Meade as a deputy who was too quick to resort to violence, driven by dangerous assumptions and a misplaced sense of righteous zeal. They delved into his prior record, highlighting red flags regarding his use of force in past incidents. The prosecutors also focused on inconsistencies in Meade's statements about the perceived threat posed by Casey, arguing that the deputy's actions were unjustified and excessive. To support their case, the prosecution called upon witnesses who testified about Casey's character and the devastating impact his death had on his family and the community. They sought to humanize Casey and emphasize the tragedy of a young life cut short by what they saw as an unnecessary use of deadly force. On the other hand, Meade's defense team maintained that the deputy acted reasonably given the totality of the circumstances. They portrayed Casey as a non-compliant and evasive suspect who Meade had valid reason to believe was armed and dangerous. The defense argued that Casey's alleged actions, such as waving a gun while driving and failing to follow Meade's commands, gave the deputy probable cause to perceive a serious threat. While acknowledging the tragedy of Casey's death, Meade's attorneys insisted that the shooting was ultimately a justified use of force in a tense, rapidly unfolding situation. They emphasized the split-second nature of the decision Meade had to make and the inherent dangers faced by law enforcement officers in the line of duty. One of the key challenges in the trial was the lack of video evidence capturing the crucial moments leading up to the shooting. With no body cameras or independent eyewitnesses to definitively prove either side's account, the case hinged heavily on Meade's own testimony. Over hours of intense questioning, Meade took the stand and laid out his version of events. He described sensing a serious threat from Casey that required a split-second decision to open fire or potentially be shot himself. Meade's testimony was emotional at times, as he recounted the fear and adrenaline that he claimed coursed through him during the encounter. As the trial progressed, it became clear that the jury was grappling with the complex and sensitive nature of the case. The 12 men and women tasked with deciding Meade's fate struggled to reach a consensus, at one point even forcing a temporary mistrial due to their inability to agree on a verdict. The judge, recognizing the gravity of the situation, brought in several alternate jurors to replace those who had been dismissed for various reasons. After 4 days of deliberations, the reconstituted jury finally returned a verdict that left many unsatisfied and searching for answers. The jury delivered a hung verdict on the murder charges, meaning they could not unanimously agree on whether Meade was guilty or not guilty of murder. However, they did acquit Meade on the lesser charge of reckless homicide, determining that his actions, while perhaps questionable, did not rise to the level of criminal recklessness. For Casey's family, who had been present throughout the emotionally wrenching trial, the outcome was a devastating blow. They left the courtroom in tears, struggling to comprehend how the man who had taken Casey's life could walk free without facing the most serious consequences. Their attorney decried the verdict as a miscarriage of justice, arguing that it highlighted the profound flaws in a system that makes it nearly impossible to hold police officers accountable for on-duty killings. He pointed to the numerous obstacles to securing convictions in such cases, from powerful police unions to ingrained biases in favor of law enforcement. Despite the setback, prosecutors vowed to retry the murder charges against Meade, determined to secure a more definitive outcome. However, this decision meant that Casey's family and the community would have to endure the gut-wrenching ordeal of another trial reliving the painful details of Casey's death and the aftermath. For Meade and his legal team, the hung jury on the murder charges represented a partial vindication, but fell short of the complete exoneration they had sought. They criticized the prosecution for what they saw as a rush to judgment, arguing that the case should never have been brought to trial in the first place. In the wake of the verdict, Meade continued to insist that he had acted as any reasonable officer would have in that situation. He expressed condolences to Casey's family for their loss, but maintained that the shooting was justified based on the information he had at the time and the threat he perceived. The outcome of the trial left many in the community frustrated, angry, and searching for answers. The lack of a clear resolution only seemed to deepen the divisions and mistrust between law enforcement and the people they are sworn to serve and protect, particularly in communities of color that have long experienced tense and fraught relationships with the police. As the dust settled on the courtroom drama, it became clear that the issues raised by Casey Goodson Jr.'s death were far from resolved. The trial, rather than providing closure, only underscored the urgent need for systemic change and a reckoning with the deep-seated problems plaguing American policing and criminal justice. For Casey's loved ones, the fight for justice and accountability was far from over. They vowed to continue pursuing every available avenue, from civil lawsuits to advocacy for policy reforms, to ensure that Casey's death would not be in vain. In the face of unimaginable grief and frustration, they clung to the hope that their tireless efforts would help bring about a future where no other family would have to endure the same pain and loss. The trial of Jason Meade may have ended, but its aftermath reverberated far beyond the walls of the courtroom. It served as a sobering reminder of the long and difficult road ahead in the quest for a more just and equitable society, one where the promise of equal protection under the law is more than just an ideal, but a lived reality for all. Asterisk, asterisk, the mixed reactions and what's next. The mistrial in the Jason Meade case and the lack of a murder conviction sparked a firestorm of debate and controversy in Columbus and across the nation. Activists and supporters of Casey Goodson Jr.'s family were outraged by the outcome, viewing it as yet another example of a racist justice system failing to hold police officers accountable for the deaths of black men. They took to the streets in protest, demanding justice for Casey and vowing to keep fighting until Meade was held responsible for his actions. On the other hand, some felt that the prosecution had overreached by pursuing murder charges against Meade. They argued that the prosecutors failed to definitively counter Meade's claim that he legitimately feared for his life in the fast-moving, high-pressure encounter with Casey. Supporters of law enforcement, including some within the police community,
Well, the FBI is continuing its investigation into the death of Casey Goodson Jr. Now, Goodson was shot and killed by a Franklin County deputy who was assisting U.S. Marshals near Goodson.
Viewed the hung jury as a reaffirmation that officers must be given latitude to make split-second judgment calls in potentially dangerous situations. The broader public's reactions to the mistrial tended to follow predictable and polarized lines, mirroring the responses to other controversial police shootings of black men in recent years. Those who were already skeptical of the police saw the outcome as further proof of unchecked brutality and racial bias among officers. They argued that the system was rigged to protect law enforcement, even in cases where the use of force was questionable or excessive. Conversely, Back the Blue proponents viewed the mistrial as a vindication of Meade's actions. They accused critics of rushing to judgment without considering the challenges officers face in making life or death decisions in the heat of the moment. Some even went so far as to suggest that Casey's own actions, such as allegedly waving a gun while driving and failing to comply with Meade's commands, contributed to the tragic outcome. As with so many aspects of this complex case, the reality defies simple narratives or easy explanations. The mistrial in the Meade case underscores the deep structural issues that plague our criminal justice system and the challenging path forward if we hope to prevent more heartbreaking situations like the one that claimed Casey Goodson Jr.'s life. The hard truth is that the Meade mistrial, rather than providing a clear-cut resolution, only highlights the major challenges inherent in definitively assessing police use of force incidents. These cases often involve complicated split-second decisions, conflicting accounts from witnesses, and broader societal pressures and biases that shape public perceptions. Untangling the truth and determining whether an officer's actions were justified can be an incredibly difficult and divisive process.
In mind, as this case moves forward, there is a family grieving the loss of a 23-year-old man, and the future of a deputy is up in the air as this case has turned into a...
At the same time, we cannot ignore the profound anguish and frustration of Casey's loved ones, who have been fighting tirelessly for accountability in his death. The fact that Meade, like many other officers involved in controversial shootings, may never face criminal consequences is a bitter pill to swallow for those seeking justice. Moreover, the pattern of officers disproportionately using lethal force against people of color, particularly black men, is a disturbing reality that demands urgent attention and action. The lack of accountability that often follows these incidents only compounds the pain and erodes trust between law enforcement and the communities they serve. While Meade may still face another trial, it won't be until late 2024.
The final autopsy report that was issued by the Franklin County Coroner's Office for Casey Goodson Jr. The report says that Goodson was shot 5 times in the back, once in the buttock.
An agonizingly long time for Casey's family and the community to wait for a resolution. The legal process, even when it does result in charges against officers, can be painfully slow and often fails to deliver the sense of justice that families and activists are seeking. Ultimately, it's clear that no single court case or jury verdict can fix the deep, systemic issues raised by the Casey Goodson shooting and other similar tragedies. Bringing about meaningful change will require concerted, good faith efforts from law enforcement agencies, lawmakers, and citizens alike. This includes addressing chronic problems within policing, such as inadequate use of force policies, insufficient de-escalation training, and the lack of robust civilian oversight. It also means tackling implicit bias and racism head-on, both within law enforcement ranks and in society at large.
Carrie and Colleen, before we get to that, I want to catch you up on the latest on the trial overall. The prosecution has called a total of 14 witnesses to the stand in this.
Furthermore, we must grapple honestly with the underlying societal factors that contribute to volatile police-citizen interactions, such as economic inequality, lack of mental health resources, and the over-policing of communities of color. Only by addressing these root causes and investing in community-based solutions can we hope to reduce the frequency of these tragic encounters. Bringing about this kind of systemic change will require sustained effort, resources, and political will. It won't be easy, but it is essential if we are to create a more just and equitable society for all. The memory of Casey Goodson Jr. and countless others demands nothing less. As we reflect on the complex legacy of this case and the work that still lies ahead, let us not lose sight of the human toll of these tragedies. For Casey's family and loved ones, the fight for justice is far from over. They, like so many other families impacted by police violence.
Now tomorrow, Meade will have his first court appearance. Will be arraigned on those charges. Those charges again, 2 counts of murder, 1 count of reckless homicide. His attorney says he plans to
deserve our support, compassion, and unwavering commitment to building a better future. Conclusion: the heartbreaking loss of Casey Goodson Jr. and winding path of the case against Jason Meade is in many ways a microcosm of the complex, painful issues with policing and racial justice America must still reckon with. There are no easy answers or quick fixes, as the hung jury shows. But we cannot let the difficulty of these conversations deter us from engaging in them honestly and thoughtfully. By refusing to look away or fall back on overly simplistic takes and truly sitting with the layers of these situations, we can inch closer to a shared set of facts and solutions. It won't bring Casey back or heal his family's profound loss, a pain no parent should have to bear. But if examining this case can shed even a bit more light on the reforms and societal changes we still need to prevent future Casey Goodson Jr.'s from having their lives cut short, it's a conversation we must keep having. My goal with this video is to thoughtfully present the details of this case to inform that vital public dialogue. I'd of course like to hear your feedback and perspective in the comments. If you found it valuable, please also consider liking, sharing, and subscribing to support more nuanced looks at major issues. Thank you for engaging with this difficult but all-important topic. We all have a role to play in forging a society of true justice and equity. In Casey's memory, and for the sake of the next generation, I hope you'll join me in continuing to grapple with these challenges. Be well.